So it was something I tried to hide and tried to ignore, but couldn't, because it's really hard to hide one's eyes unless you just don't look at people, which was kind of a habit of mine too.
Welcome to Zestful Aging, the podcast where we celebrate aging with vibrance and we defy the stereotypes of what it means to age. I'm your host, Nicole Christina, a psychotherapist of more than 30 years, here to introduce you to my off-the-mainstream guests who will energize and inspire you. My hope is to create optimism about getting older and help you cultivate zest and joy in this season of your life. And I love to hear feedback from you, my listeners. Please drop me a line at zestfulaging@gmail.com. I read every single comment. And to find out more about this podcast, hop on over to zestfulaging.com. Well, today we're going to start with a quick pop quiz. Do you know what an ocularist is? Neither did I until I went to a talk by today's guest, author Dan Roche. And I never would have known about Dan or his new book about glass eyes unless I was friends with the illustrator of his book, Eyes by Hand. And it is fascinating. Today, we're going to learn about the somewhat obscure world of glass eye making and talk about the psychological and emotional healing that such service brings to someone who has suffered the very visible trauma of eye loss. Welcome to the show, Professor Roche.
Thank you, Nicole. It's really wonderful to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
I really loved going to your talk, and I thought it was so interesting. You know, you started off by saying, hey, I'm a little nervous here, although the book is out. Your colleagues and other people have read it, but it sounds like there was still something about exposure there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I've been working at that college, Lemoyne, for almost 25 years, and so I know the people very well. We're very friends, but I'd never really talked about my eye issues with very many of them, and I spent 50 years with what I consider, a bad eye. It was I was born with a congenital cataract, so it was always a big splotch on the pupil, and the eye was not in line with the other eye, and so that was the main sort of catalyst for my self-identity and interactions with people through my childhood and teenage years, and well beyond that as well too. So it was something I tried to hide and tried to ignore, but couldn't, because it's really hard to hide one's eyes unless you just don't look at people, which was kind of a habit of mine too. So, when I wrote the book, I knew, the only way to really write this book honestly is to sort of let myself be seen in all kind of ways that might be very uncomfortable too. And that was a constant thing that I had to tell myself as I was writing, just go there. And so then when I, did the reading in front of, 60 or 70 people that I worked with and students and friends, I knew it would be comfortable, but it was also a brand new thing. And in academia, you don't always, expose yourself personally when you're talking about books you read. They're more, you tend to hide behind or not even hide behind, but just have that sort of the subject in front of you, between you two. But this book called for a different kind of exposure, I guess. And I knew that I would have to sort of make the presentation and the talk as open as I could. So, so to put up on the screen, my fifth grade picture and my high school picture. I have never showed those pictures to anybody.
Wow. Wow. I mean, this is so major. It's just, it's like, I mean, this is maybe the most trite thing that you could say, but like, it is a new world, right? It's a new chapter.
Yeah, yeah, and I use the word sort of life changing. That's a very trite term too, but and it doesn't change everything. For me, living with that eye that was damaged or deformed or whatever the word might be for 50 years, the self consciousness is so
Mm.
deeply embedded that even as much of it went as much of it. Went away after I got my prosthetic eye, and I suddenly had two eyes that looked the same, which was, a dream come true. Another cliche, but absolutely true.
Mm.
um,
Hmm.
that I would say 80 to 90% of that self consciousness went away, but not all of it because it's just so habitual and
Oh,
so deeply
sure. You were
embedded.
steeped in it. I mean,
Yeah,
that was your identity. It sounds like, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like damaged was um kind of part of the identity.
yeah, yeah, and it's weird too because I had no other health problems. I was very athletic and very healthy all through my life. And so it seems from the outside, I think, like a very minor thing. And a lot of people told me, oh, I never even paid attention to it. I never even noticed it. But for me, and for anybody who has something that's so, um, I guess, obvious to themselves and that they see all the time, for me, it was just a constant presence, a constant kind of weight. I sometimes thought of it as like this balloon floating next to my head that was just kind of dark and never went away,
Oh,
and I was
wow.
always aware of it. And in every conversation, every face to face experience, whether it was one on one or whether I was teaching and in front of a group or whatever. So
It had a life of its own.
it did. It was felt very uncontrollable, and like I said. As a kid, I just wanted to sort of rip it out. I just thought of, dreamed about just sort of getting rid of it sort of violently. And
Did your
fortunately,
parent Oh, yeah. Were your parents able to talk to you about, I mean, this is the prior generation who didn't necessarily watch Oprah and know about emotional intelligence and words and putting words to feelings. How did your family how were they with you around this?
it was mostly ignored, I think. I we didn't talk about it in any helpful way for me. My father did not uh, believe in, I mean, psychologists, sorry, and
Mhm.
psychotherapy and stuff. And he was like, "You take
Mhm.
care of yourself." And he was a military guy, and not to
Mhm.
be stereotyped, but he was pretty self sufficient in that way and expected that. And I think that we never did talk about it, but I think that it was a thing between us, at least between me and my father, because he had he had eyes that were he had gorgeous eyes. He had green eyes that people complimented all the time, and I just
Mhm.
saw, I know he used them as sort of social currency. He kind of knew that he had, startling
Mhm.
eyes, and um, and I was so self conscious of mine, and so it was something that never got spoken between us, except in ways that were kind of, to be honest, hurtful, because the only
Mhm.
time it would come up would be if he would joke about it.
Mhm.
He would tell a story about when I was maybe two, and the doctors who had not taken off the cataract when I was born because they just didn't do that at the time. Instead, patched my good eye, hoping that the bad eye would sort of take up, its duties, and it didn't. I just ran into walls and ran into the furniture, and my dad,
Mhm.
he would tell that story and just laugh, which just made me so angry every
Oh,
time. It was this teasing that just I couldn't tell whether he couldn't help it, whether he really enjoyed it, whether it was just a defense mechanism for him, whether he felt
Mhm.
bad or guilty or just couldn't understand what it might be like to have, something that was so sort of powerful for him to be um, anything different than that too.
Oh,
Uh,
that's fascinating. It's so interesting. I see clients who are well into adulthood still talk about being teased and bullied as kids and the repercussions of that as adults, still
yeah,
having to kind of work through that, like, oh, maybe I'm not a whatever, fill in the blank.
yeah. And I talked to some ocularists, a couple who told me that what they tell the parents of the kids that they treat is like, talk about it, talk about it. Treat it. One ocularist said she tells parents, like, treat it like a Purple Heart, treat it like a badge of honor, because the previous generations, the advice was often, you have a prosthetic eye, don't talk about it, don't let anybody know, hide it, and people
Mm,
had to deal with that tension of being forced to try to hide it. So in my family, my sister tells me now, oh, we never even thought about it, you were just you. But for me, that always felt like, you're not
mm,
seeing me, you're not
mhm.
seeing me.
And I
Yeah.
mean, you touched on this, but it's something about having, a hand or a foot or a hip or whatever, but you talked about the importance of the eyes and how people place great value in being able to see you, being able to, sort of read you through your eyes, that it's a very particular kind of organ.
Yeah, it is, another cliche, the soul, the window to the soul,
Mhm.
but there's a lot to that, of course. And human contact is so often eye contact. And
Mhm.
if you kind of are really hesitant about engaging in that, then it has some repercussions on your relationships.
Of course, of course. So later in life, you had a medical person say, "We can help you with that."
Yes, an ophthalmologist. I had been going to one ophthalmologist, and for 5 or 6 years, and or maybe a little bit more, I guess. And the eye was kind of degrading. It was getting very scar covered in its later years, and it was the internal pressure was increasing, so it throbbed a lot. It gave me a lot of headaches. It made it hard to read for more than 20 or 30 minutes, or to drive for more than an hour. So I would go into him and say, I think I'm ready. I was in my 40s. I think I'm ready to be done with this. So I'm ready to have this gone. And he was kind of the old school of, we don't get rid of a otherwise healthy organ. Maybe it was a sign of failure for that kind of ophthalmologist. But I switched ophthalmologists. I went
Mhm.
shopping around, and
Mm.
as soon as this new one walked into the room, he saw me, he saw my eye, he said, "We can take care of that."
Oh my gosh.
But he knew what the options were, and he'd worked with an ocularist before, and he knew that the healing is not, it can take a different route. It can involve removing a body part and then replacing it with, something else, and that's where a different kind of healing comes in, I guess, too. So I was so happy to find him.
Oh,
It was the best, thing that could have happened at
I
that point.
wonder, do you remember? You must, the appointment. I think you said it was in Rochester.
Well, that
Oh,
my ophthalmologist was here in Syracuse,
okay.
and the ocularist is in Rochester.
I see. And when you heard those words, "We can take care of that," I'm trying to imagine what that must have been like.
It was, yeah. It was words I'd wanted to hear for 50 years, really. And I'd wondered for so long why the doctors didn't take care of it when I was an infant. I went back and did some reading about surgery practices in the late 50s, early 60s, and found out that they it just wasn't a thing that they typically did. So, cataract surgery, even as simple as it is now, was much more complicated at the time. So I had always, and because it had not, I never heard those words from my family. Not that they could have done much, I guess. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't heard them from any other eye doctor. And I didn't really know anything about prosthetic eyes, really. Not much more than anybody else really does. I kind of knew they existed, but I had just kind of a Hollywood vision of them, I guess. And
you were introduced to a whole new world.
yes, and it's a small world because there are like fewer than 200 professional ocularists or eye makers in the country, in the United States and Canada, and then even fewer in countries around the world. But it's a fascinating world, and it's a world of that I found out is sort of just kind of waiting there for people who need it. But most people don't know about it, and maybe that's partly because it's so small, and partly because the goal of an ocularist is to have their work not be seen, not be visible.
Oh, right. They
It's
want to
supposed
fly under the radar, right? If
right.
they do a good job, nobody says, "Where did you get your prosthetic?"
Nobody knows that they did the work if they do if they are able to do that kind of job.
So
And
interesting. Oh
yeah.
my gosh. So what's your first appointment like? You decide, I'm going to go through with this. And do you remember what that was like?
Yeah. So my ophthalmologist referred me to a surgeon, an oculoplastic surgeon who does, eye removals. And so I went to see him and had that procedure done. It's an outpatient procedure, so you walk in, have it done in 45 minutes, and then walk home or go home, which is a little disconcerting. But so then you wait 6 weeks for the socket to heal up, and then I went to visit the ocularist in Rochester, and I was kind of fortunate that there's one within an hour and a half drive or so of me, because they are pretty rare. So I drove over, and I had a patch over my eye, and there's this kind of was a little bit metaphoric. On the highway between here and Rochester, there's a place called the Montezuma Wildlife Refuge, and it's a bird migrated bird sanctuary kind of thing. There's thousands, millions of birds stop there on their migrations each year, and there are probably a dozen these days, dozen to 15 sort of eagles nesting sites. But back in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of eagles who stayed there or lived there or migrated there also. But then DDT came on the scene, and people were spraying this pesticide, with happy abandon, and all of the eagle nesting sites disappeared. And for decades, there weren't any; they all just disappeared there. And so that land was just kind of damaged in a way that was deeply severe.
I didn't know that story about Montezuma. I knew about the DDT. I didn't know that was a problem there.
Yeah, and then at that time, they reintroduced the eagles there in 1976 during the bicentennial, and at the time there was only one known eagle nesting site in all of the state of New York. It had sort of decimated the population. So they reintroduced it, and now they're a pretty healthy population and everything. And so, but I drove by there, and I actually stopped to take a hike on their trails, and it was kind of a metaphor for this this geography that had been damaged and then had to be repaired.
Mhm.
And I thought, okay, this is really appropriate for my
Mhm.
own journey right here too, because I I felt like, we could have taken care of this a long time ago. It maybe didn't have to be, maybe it did have to be this way. I don't know. But I felt like I was on that journey of sort of repairing something that had been unnecessarily a burden or a damage or life, altering and limiting in some ways. So, um, yeah, that was kind of the
Wow.
context for my first visit.
Oh, that story is giving me chills, and I think of the expression eagle eyes.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much there. It sounds, oh gosh, it sounds almost native in its, the storytelling about with the eagle and what it means.
Yeah, yeah, and I was open to that kind of sort of metaphoric
Oh,
sort of
wow.
context and stuff. But when I got to the office, little place in a medical park, nothing fancy, and I met the ocularist, Michael Strauss, and I had no idea really what to expect. I'd seen some pictures on their website, but otherwise I was pretty clueless, and it was just so comfortable, and he was so I don't know, welcoming and matter of fact, but also um, just friendly in a way that I found ocularists to be when I started interviewing a lot of them. Just kind of this generosity of
Mhm.
treatment, and that first meeting, that first appointment was, I think, 4 or 5 hours as we talked a lot, as he kind of started to fit and mold and craft a prosthetic eye. So it was a long time, a lot of eye contact that I had to give myself over to, and I sort of
Mhm.
implicitly trusted him because I knew he had seen this many, many times in a lot worse
Mhm.
cases than mine.
It's safe there.
Yeah, it was very safe. It was very safe, and I don't know exactly what it was about it that felt so safe, but it was his sort of demeanor, his openness, and the fact that I knew that he was going to do something that was going to make was what I wanted, and I was nervous, of course, of how it would turn out, but I kind of just you know began to trust in his abilities, and they turned out to be well placed trust.
Mhm.
And then the next week, so that was 4 or 5 hours of doing built a wax model of an eye and shapes it, and then you go away and he makes it into an acrylic version, and then you come back for another 4 or 5 hours when the painting is done, and it's all hand painted, handcrafted. So I had to sit, and his wife, actually, Michelle Strauss, is the painter in the business, and I sat with her, and again, it was a long time of just letting myself be looked at in a way
Mhm.
that literally longer than I'd ever let anybody look at me in the eye, and
Mhm.
and she
And
would
it
look very closely. She was looking as a painter, she wasn't looking as a friend or a romantic partner or anything like that. She was looking as a person who was making something for me, but she had to look very closely at my natural eye in order to know how to
Mhm.
paint the other one, and then she put it in, and just and even if it was like that, I just felt um, this kind of exhilaration that was part anxiety because I was being looked at so closely in a way that I never allowed myself before to do, and that was part just liberation, letting myself be looked at like
Well,
that.
I mean, I'm imagining whatever happens that we can't see or what's happening in your brain. I would have loved to have like a PET scan as this was happening because it sounds like there was active healing going on.
It felt like that to me, definitely. I could feel it. Yeah, not to over dramatize it or something, but I could kind of feel it happening. And
Mm.
and I think I mentioned this in the reading, but you know, she would take the eye and put it on the table in front of her and paint the iris and the pupil and the red veins and whatnot. And then she would put it in my eye socket and she would look at it. And then she'd say, okay, I need to do this and this. And she'd take it out and start do more painting. And as the hours went on, it felt to me as if that little piece of plastic was kind of changing in its nature. So when it was on the table in front of her, you know, it felt like a piece of acrylic, you know, just an inanimate thing. But when she put it in, it almost, it felt like it was kind of, I don't know what the right word is, coming to life or something,
Becoming you.
becoming me. And the more she did that, the more it felt like that transition was happening. And I didn't see it because she didn't have a mirror in her room, you know, and so but I could feel it. And it felt like each time she put it in and the more the hours went by and it got closer and closer to being finished, and and then Michael would come in and they would talk about, you know, what little things still needed to be done with the painting or the shaping or the fit. And it just felt like it was becoming more and more organic.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, I left with the eye, and I went out to the car and I sat there and I looked in the rearview mirror, and you know, I called my wife because she was back in Syracuse, and I was just choked up. I could hardly talk. You know,
I can imagine nothing less. I mean, I can't. This is something that there's some magic in here somewhere. The transformation, the depth of the transformation sounds so profound.
Yeah. It surprised me. You know, I wanted it, but it's one of those things that for me anyway, it's hard to imagine what it is until it happens. But it did feel incredibly profound. I felt so, you know, euphoric for, you know, weeks afterwards, you know, and I would look in the mirror and, you know, there were times, I don't know if it was early on, but certainly after a couple of months, I would look in the mirror and I wouldn't remember right offhand which eye was real and which one wasn't.
Yeah.
And I'd have to think for a second, you know, and then so every time that happened, I had that sort of recurrence of euphoria, and it just felt like a gift that, you know, had been waiting for so long.
You tell the story of was it your 6-year-old who said, which eye is it? And
it was, you know, in those first month or two, you know, I was putting him to bed and leaned over to give him a goodnight kiss, and he grabbed me by the shoulders and he looked back and forth between the two eyes. He said, now, which one is your real one? And that's when I knew that really that it had, you know, it was working. And it was obviously, you know, felt so good to be able to just hold my eyes open for him in that way and let him look so closely at me as I looked back at him too.
What did your wife say when you arrived home?
You know, she was, I don't know, impressed. She was really happy for me. She thought it was beautiful. I don't think she was ever bothered by the eye that I had before. At least she says she wasn't. I don't. I'm always skeptical of people who say that, even her. But you know, she was very. I think she was very relieved that I was taken care of in a way that somebody could do like that, which was very generous and nice. You know, I think that's what made her happiest.
And that you could share that with someone.
Yeah.
Well, hi, Zesties. In addition to being a podcaster and psychotherapist, I'm an avid thrifter. And I think it's something you either love or you hate. I've always loved finding treasures, and it makes me happy to keep things out of the landfill. You may already know that fast fashion is a real scourge on the environment. And I have a few podcast episodes that explore this. One of my favorites is with Eric Minter, who's the world's authority on the secondhand market. His book, Secondhand, is really recommended. And here I'm digressing. The reality is that I love to thrift, but I also like to wear the same basic outfit. So I've started an account on eBay I wanted to tell you about. Here's a humble brag. I have an eye for quality pieces. Linen and cashmere are my favorites, and I'd love you to check it out. Go on eBay and type in Nikki's Thrifty, and it's NICKY''S Thrifty with a Y, and see what you think. I'd love your feedback. You have a reading for us today.
I'd be glad to read a little section, and this is a section that is in the last chapter, and it's about which is about sort of life after having gotten the prosthetic eye, and it's about a writer's retreat that I went to for a few days, and I'll just read this about a page and a half or so. I was at a 4-day writing retreat with a dozen of my colleagues. Though we had hours each day to work alone, this was a communal gathering built around the goal of freshening and deepening our creative efforts through contemplative practices, led by a wisdom teacher named Bill Redfield. We did group meditations, had long and frank discussions about our work, about its connections to the rest of our lives, to our values, to ourselves as individuals, and as members of our communities. We nodded to each other in the mornings during silent breakfasts, then talked over good dinners and, later in the evening, over bottles of wine, against Bill's gentle suggestions that we get to bed early and maintain our contemplative bearings. I was in the early stages of writing this book, and I read aloud to the group some draft passages about my bad eye. Before that, I had never talked with any of those people about my eye. Some of them had known me before I got my prosthetic, and some hadn't. Some knew I had a prosthetic, and some didn't. The passages I shared contained or hinted at, I think, anger over doctors not removing my cataract right away, resentment about not having been cared for as I wanted but didn't know how to request, shame, and self-consciousness. I was trying to lay some things out there. Bill guided the retreat with tenderness, led us in exercises meant to deepen our experience of presence, which would come, he explained, through experiences of surrender, attention, and compassion, the last of which rests upon self-forgiveness. The sessions and the hours each of us spent alone thinking and writing, sometimes napping, felt increasingly safe and full of empathy. Much of the wisdom Bill offered to us or helped us to discover for ourselves grew from his previous work as a therapist and as an Episcopal parish priest. He pointed to how Western culture prioritizes the intellectual and encourages us to define things by differentiation, separation, division, and then suggested the alternate possibilities of considering everything as integral, ourselves as integrated. He encouraged us to be open-hearted, to break out of our self-protective shells, to strive for an authenticity of being that transcended liking or disliking, and instead simply recognized. I was moved and persuaded by his ideas, by the ways the group was opening within and beyond itself, by the urge to leave behind every judgment I'd made or imagined being made about my old eye. Yet it was never lost on me that I'd had to rid myself of that authentic thing and replace it with a trick, a disguise, in order to consider the possibilities Bill talked about as attainable for myself. On our final morning together, after meditation, we would end the retreat at noon. Bill told the group, "Before we part, I would like to look into your eyes. I will go around the room and stand in front of each of you, hold your hands, and we will look into each other's eyes for 15 or 20 seconds. No words." There was nervous laughter. One person clapped her hands in excitement. Others groaned, but accepted the inevitable, like kids submitting to a kiss from an aunt they barely know. I was taken by surprise, felt the old anxiety, and yet also an excitement of capability. Several people glanced my way. I described what looking into someone's eyes was like for me and how little I still did it, even with my new eye. We stood in a circle. Bill faced the first person, took his hands, looked into his eyes. There was a slight smile on Bill's face, relaxed, generous. The person looked back. Without a nod or a word, Bill gently released the person's hands and moved to the next person. I was fourth in line. I gave him my hands. I dropped my shoulders, breathed. Bill's eyes were blue. He was about 70, but his youthfulness was vibrant, his calmness full. What surprised me most was that Bill's gaze did not seem to be focused on any one part of me. It felt wide, all-encompassing, not diffused into seeing discrete parts, but taking me in as an entirety. And though the exchange was brief, the 20 seconds it took was long enough for me to relax into the same kind of generous looking. That kind of looking required, I understood, even as it was happening, that I look at him, not at him looking at me. When he let go of my hands, I felt elevated. Months later, when I saw Bill again, I asked him why he did that, why he chose that series of eye contacts. I find, he said, that in terms of grounding myself in a group of people and just connecting with them, it's a very powerful way. I mean, a hug is also. This is just a different kind of intensity from a hug, and it's reciprocal. That's what I love about it. He'd gotten to the point in his life when, he continued, I just long to connect. That's the purpose of my life. I long to connect. And when I can do that, when I can look into somebody's eyes, I mean, in ordinary conversation, we look into each other's eyes, but in a sustained way, there's something that's spoken through that kind of intentionality that says, I am here. I am meeting you here. That's that part.
Would you say that that was also a healing experience?
Oh, incredibly, yes. Yes. And the next part after that is a story I tell about going to see my father. He had, just before I got my prosthetic eye, he had a massive stroke, and he was unable to walk or talk for the rest of the life. He lived another year and a half, but he was in a nursing home. And I didn't see him for several months because I was, having my eye issues here, and he was in a nursing home, and he was in Ohio. So I tell the story of finally going to see him after Christmas and walking in and feeling like I was a little bit of an intruder because my mom and my sisters had been taking care of him for those months and being his advocate and spending all the time with him. And there wasn't a lot I could do, but my mom said, "Oh, Dan's here. He's got a new eye. Go show him your new eye." So, I walked over, and he was lying in bed, and he was very antsy and kind of moving around and everything at that time. And I leaned over him, and he stopped moving, and he just looked at me, and and I said, "I got a new eye." And he looked at me in a way that I'm not sure he ever had before. It felt like just so intensely, and it was almost like it was, he couldn't say anything, but it was almost like here was another part of his life that was deeply changed, and he didn't know what to make of it. But we looked at each other, without pulling away for, I don't know, a couple minutes, 3 minutes or whatever. And he was just staring deeply into my eyes in a way he just never had in his in his life.
Oh my gosh!
And I felt completely very liberated there too. But I couldn't tell whether it was because I was letting him look at me, or whether it's because I was forcing him to look at me because I was suddenly in the controlling position there too. And it was a very mixed kind of thing. But in either way, we were looking at each other, and even though he couldn't talk or move much, his eyes were still extremely expressive. And so there was a lot happening there.
Wow. Oh my, yeah. The profound transformation. Dan, where can people find your book and learn more about your story?
I have a website called,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the book's title, eyesbyhand.com.
Okay.
All one word. It's out on, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, MIT Press site. MIT is the publisher. So it's available at any bookstore that you want, but eyesbyhand.com has those links there, plus some other information. It has some links to ocularist websites that are really interesting if you want to know more about prosthetic eyes in that way as well, too.
And you're doing another local reading, is that correct?
I'm doing a book sighting
Oh.
on November, I forget the date, 18th. It's a Saturday night before Thanksgiving at the local bookstore, Parthenon Books.
And is that information on the
Yeah,
eyesbyhand.com?
there's an
Okay.
event page there, so that's on there too.
Excellent. So if people are local or even not so local, I would highly recommend coming to see Dan and hear more. I so appreciate you talking to me today and being so open and honest about this experience. It's so fascinating, and it really stuck with me after I was able to attend your readings. So thank you so much again.
Well, I have to say that this is, even reading from the book or talking about it like this it feels like part of the healing process for me. It's not done. This feels really like some things are kind of just getting played out. I start choking up when I read that passage about the retreat, and because it feels, it feels present again. And so being able to do this kind of thing, I think is a real unexpected bonus of having written the book. So I appreciate the invitation and being able to talk here.
Eyes by Hand. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on Zestful Aging. If you like the podcast, please share it with some of your friends.
Our theme song is All I Did Was Wait for You by Kjartan Abel. Visit Kjartan-Abel, that's KJARTAN-Abel, ABEL.com to hear more of Kjartan's work. And our technical director is Stephen Litweiler.
And stay tuned next week for another interview with a fascinating and inspiring guest. See you then.